Good evening. May I explain to you for a moment the nature of spiritual revelation, so that as the years unfold, you will not be surprised at some of the things that will take place in your life. And perhaps even some of you, at least, will be able to remember back to tonight and remember that you heard this, even though you may not have been able to accept it or wholly profit by it at the moment. Truth itself is not difficult. As a matter of fact, it is very simple. That was why the Master could say that children can receive it. Be as a little child, and you will be able to receive truth. But as an adult, as a mature person, you will find truth very difficult to receive. It is for this reason that you may hear or read a truth, a statement of truth, or a principle of truth, and you may say to yourself, yes, this is the truth, and find that nothing happens to you. It doesn't change anything. And you may think that, well, why did I have to read that? Or why did it seem true to me? Or why didn't it do something for me? But I must tell you the nature of truth. It is a seed. Every truth that you hear or read that makes you feel, yes, this is truth, that is a seed that is taken into your consciousness, and you can no more expect it to do something for you tomorrow than if you planted a seed of apples today and expected to find apples growing in your yard tomorrow. You can't do it. As a matter of fact, you plant your trees, and it may be months before you even see the tiniest little bit of green showing above the ground. And you wonder what took place all of that time. But you know what took place. The seed broke open. The seed took root. The seed began to accept food into itself. And then all of a sudden that food began to spread and became a shoot. And the first thing you know, it appeared above the ground. If you're patient, it becomes a bush, a tree. And if you're still more patient, later on it becomes blossoms, and then probably apples or peaches or pears. So it is that when truth touches your consciousness, do not think for a moment that you are now in heaven, or that now that you have received this truth, that all the rest of your days are going to be heaven on earth. No, you have merely had a seed of truth planted in your consciousness. And if you will abide in that truth, if you will let that seed abide in you, if you will ponder it, it will come forth into full fruitage. If truth were just something intellectual like 12 times 12 or 144, then perhaps when you hear it once, it's yours forever. But because truth isn't intellectual, it's spiritual, it must first be taken into the mind and there be allowed to be nurtured, fed within, and then eventually it comes out from you as a realized truth, as a demonstrated truth. I can illustrate that for you this way. I can give you a truth tonight that some years from now you will realize is the ultimate truth. Someday you will realize you heard a very profound truth. But probably tomorrow you'll wonder why it didn't do something for you. Or next week or next month, and by that time you will have forgotten it entirely. And it may be months, it may be years, before all of a sudden this truth will spring out of you and do miracles for you, and you'll say, well, why didn't that happen years ago when I first heard it? But the reason is that you may hear it with your mind, you may not yet hear it with your inner ear, your spiritual ear. We can all be healed of our discords very quickly if we will release God. Release God from any responsibility to heal us. Now, right while you're sitting here, release God and acknowledge you seek nothing of God, you desire nothing of God, you wish nothing of God. You release God unto himself. Why? Because you understand that God made all that was good. God made all that was made. And all that God made is good. Anything that God did not make was never made. Anything that God did make is good. Therefore, you do not need God now. God's work was done in the beginning. You do not need God to correct his mistakes. He has made no mistakes. You do not need God to heal you, for in the whole kingdom of God there is nothing to be healed. Therefore, instead of living this life of duality, which is one of saying, I am sick, now God, come to me and do something, let us live the life of single-mindedness, in which we declare, certainly God, all that is God made, all that God made he looked upon and declared to be good. Anything that God did not make was not made, therefore has no existence. Therefore, since there is no evil, I can release God from all responsibility. I can release God from... I just can release God and let him go. Do I not know that the sun will rise tomorrow? Yes, I do. Regardless of any clouds there may be in the sky to hide it, be assured the sun will rise, and I have released God. I'm not going to sit up tonight and pray to God to bring up the sun tomorrow. I know that God is about God's business. Therefore the sun will rise. I know the tides will come in and the tides will go out. Therefore I will not sit up tonight and pray that they come in or that they go out. I will release God, knowing that God is forever about his business. God does not owe it to me to bring in or out the tides or bring up the sun or set the sun. God does not owe it to me to bring forth apples from apple trees. But God is doing it, only God is not doing it for me. God is doing it as a fulfillment of God's own being. You will find the counterpart of that on earth. You may have heard sometimes, or perhaps some of you may even have felt, that you have done things for your children. Now the truth is that no parent in the history of the world has ever done anything for their children. Anything that a parent has done is in the fulfillment of their own nature as parents. That's why they've done it. They fool themselves if they think they have done it for any other reason. When an artist paints a picture, he doesn't paint it for you or for me or for a public. He is fulfilling his own nature. He may be disappointed if you and I don't appreciate it, but then he really didn't paint it for you or for me or for anyone else. It was the fulfillment of his own nature. Any of you who have had experience with any form of art or literature, I mean of a creative nature, you know that whatever you've done, you had to do as a fulfillment of yourself. While you would like others to appreciate it, even if they didn't, you had to do it. So you will find also, when you examine yourself, that whatever you have done for your children, or whatever you have done for your neighbor, whatever you have done of philanthropy, of charity, benevolence, you haven't done it for the poor. You have done it as a fulfillment of your own nature. It was your own nature that had to pour itself out. So you'll find that God does nothing for you, and God does nothing for me. God does everything as a fulfillment of the nature of God, and it isn't only that he picks out the good to do it for his rain falls on the just and the unjust. His beauty is found in all countries. His grace is found among people of all colors, of all religions, of all races, of all varieties of everything. Why? Because God is never doing anything for the white race or for the black race. God is never doing anything for Jews or for Protestants or for Catholics. Whatever God is doing as a fulfillment of his own being, and he's doing it universally. Now, you and I benefit by this grace of God, not because God is picking us out or seeking us out to do good for, but because we are opening our consciousness, we are opening ourselves to receive the grace of God, which is forever flowing, which is forever on earth as it is in heaven. When you begin to see that God is really fulfilling his own nature. He's fulfilling the fatherhood of God, really also fulfilling the motherhood of God. God is the protective, maintaining, sustaining influence, but God is also the loving, the gentle influence. Therefore, the fatherhood of God and the motherhood of God are always being expressed. When you and I accept that and stop thinking in terms of God do this for me or for mine, in other words, release God, loose him and let him go, and find that the grace of God is as much yours as mine, as much mine as yours, then you begin to find that you have entered a whole new consciousness of life. Now this is, let us call it, high revelation. This is ultimate revelation of the nature of God. But you'll be surprised that even though this seed is now planted within your consciousness, that you may not tomorrow or the day after fully realize what has happened to you in knowing this truth. But be assured of this, one of these days you will wake up, you may not be thinking of this at all, and all of a sudden something will come into your thought and you'll say, yes, God is love, or God is life. But you won't think of it just in connection with you. You realize that this is a universal truth about God's nature and God's being. It is so with us. We think of the great works of the Master, and we think he did these works for us. No, he wasn't thinking of us. He was fulfilling his own nature. What he did, he had to do as the fulfillment of his nature. He couldn't do less, and there wasn't any more to do. He did it all. Greater love hath no man than to lay down his life. But sometimes we think that he laid down his life for you or for me, or for the Hebrews of his day. No, he had already discovered that most of them weren't even appreciating his message. Most of them were rejecting it. He didn't lay his life down for them. He laid his life down as a fulfillment of the vision within him that in losing his life he was gaining it. In giving of himself, he was receiving the spirit of himself, the godliness of himself, the fulfillment of himself. So it is. When you begin this, shall we call it systematic study, for there is somewhat of a system to it, you will discover that the infinite way is made up of specific principles, not one of which is original, because there is no such thing as original truth. Even the truth that was voiced by the Master, there isn't a statement that he gave that wasn't published long before he was on earth. There is no such thing as original truth, but there is truth which has not been accepted in consciousness, or which has been accepted for a time and then has passed from the earth for one reason or another. One of these principles with which you will work and which will be responsible for most of the good that comes into your experience will be the principle which we sometimes call one power and which we sometimes call none power. Whether you read in the Infinite Way writings about one power or whether you read about none power, be assured now that you're reading about the same thing. None power and one power means the same thing. And I want to explain that to you now, because one of these days this principle will have to come right back into your conscious awareness and produce miracles for you. In the human way of living, there are two powers. There is a power for good and a power for evil. Just as we can use the mind two ways. We can use the mind for good purposes, or we can use the mind for evil purposes, or we can use the mind for unselfish purposes. We can use the mind for selfish purposes. Why? Because in the human picture there are always these pairs of opposites. Not only that some people use good power principally and other people use bad power principally, but the fact of the matter is that all of us use the power of good sometimes and the power of evil at other times. None of us is immune from the pairs of opposites in our human experience. Electricity can be used to give us light or heat or cold or warmth. Electricity can be used to kill. Airplanes are used for transportation, speed, comfort, and airplanes are used to kill. So it is that anything, even medicines which cure sometimes can kill. In the human picture, you are always dealing with two powers. When you come to a spiritual revelation, you will discover that the secret of the Spirit is that there is only one power. You will discover why the Master could say to Pilate, who was the Khrushchev of his particular day, "Thou couldst have no power over me unless it were given thee of God." He could look right at Pilate, he could look him right in the face and say, "Thou couldst have no power over me. I don't fear you. Thou couldst have no power over me unless it were given thee of God." And you will remember that as he spoke to the crippled, he would say, "What did hinder you? Rise, pick up your bed and walk." In other words, from his spiritual outlook, disease had no power. He didn't ask God to heal the cripple. He just said, "What did hinder you? There is no power in that disease." To the blind man, he didn't ask God to heal the blind man. He just said, "Open your eyes." There is no power in that disease. In other words, if you really read the four Gospels and follow the healings performed by Jesus, you will discover something miraculous. He never once prayed to God to heal anybody. He never once asked God to do anything for anybody. In every case, he just acknowledged that God is the only power, and that this appearance that we're facing It isn't a power at all. And so he faced every situation from the standpoint of one power, not the standpoint of having God be a power over the power of sin or the power of disease or the power of lack. Even when he was feeding the multitudes, he didn't pray to God for food. He just said to his disciples, break and share, divide, give. In other words, he did not acknowledge a power of lack. He never acknowledged a power of disease. He never acknowledged the power of sin. He didn't ask God ever to heal anyone of sin. He just said, neither do I condemn thee. In other words, there is no power in this. And so, you face every situation in life from the standpoint that no situation has any power. Since God is the only power, disease can have no power, sin can have no power, fear can have no power. There is no power but God. And remember that the kingdom of God is within you. Therefore, all power, and the only power there is within you. But don't make the mistake of trying to use it to heal somebody or reform somebody or enrich somebody, because you will fail. Don't try to use God power. Now, you will not find this teaching anywhere but in this message of the infinite way. You will not find this exemplified in the actual living conditions of our everyday world. Whether we are dealing with a national condition, a weather condition, a condition of health, we in the infinite way are taught to face every situation with the realization that since God, the presence within me, is the only power, I need not fear what mortal man can do. I need not fear what mortal condition can do. I need not fear what mortal belief can do, because there is but one power, and it is within me. Now remember, it does not have to be used, and do you understand why? Because if that is the only power there is, there's nothing to use it on. Now see how revolutionary this is in your own consciousness. When you start to look out at this world of appearances and remember all of the appearance of evil that you can think of, that you read in the paper today or heard on the air today, or that you know about among your friends or family, and then remember, the only reasons these conditions persist is that we believe they have power. And we are trying, mistakenly, to exert a God power to do something to that which has no power, and which is no power. You cannot, at the moment, even imagine the depth of this unfoldment. You cannot imagine the effect of it in your life when you begin to accept within yourself that out here there is no power. All power is within me, And it doesn't have to be used because there's nothing out here to use it on or use it against. Now, until you practice this principle, you'll find that you do not, even though while hearing it you may agree with it, even though while hearing it it may sound logical to you, it may even feel good to know that really there's no power even to use God against. Nevertheless, tomorrow when you're facing life, the appearances of life, there will be that old temptation again to reach out for God, to want God to do something to this evil. And you have to train yourself. No, God, I released you last night. You go ahead and fulfill yourself. You be about your own business. I know that there is nothing in heaven or on earth that we need any power for that isn't already functioning. All the power that is necessary to bring up the sun tomorrow is already in work. All the power necessary to bring in and out the tides is already in work. All the power necessary to grow your crops or your cattle is already in work. All the power necessary to function your life and mine is already at work, and all we have to do is acknowledge it. Acknowledge God in all thy ways. Acknowledge that God is fulfilling himself. God's nature is to fulfill himself. God's nature is to fulfill himself as the peace on earth, as the divine grace in your life. You don't pray for grace. You don't ask for grace. You acknowledge grace as God's means of fulfilling himself on earth. God's means of fulfilling himself on earth is the power of grace. When we acknowledge that and let ourselves be receptive, we find it functioning in our life. If we try to use it, if we try to make it happen, we are trying to play God. Let it happen. Let it happen. Let God's grace, let the activity of God fulfill itself. Let God be the only presence and the only power, and do not believe these appearances out here which seem to need you or me to go around swinging a big stick, even a big spiritual stick. No. Spiritual power is not a power over something. Spiritual power is the activity of God forever functioning. The moment you realize this and give up all attempt to use spiritual power, you will find that spiritual power is fulfilling itself in your experience. Spiritual power is not something you use. Spiritual power is something you acknowledge to be the infinite presence and power of God on earth as it is in heaven. Where is God? No place. No place. God couldn't be limited to a place. God is infinite, eternal fulfillment. Therefore, the only answer to the question is, God is here. And it makes no difference whether you are saying that in Sweden or in the United States, the North Pole, the South Pole. The only answer is the place whereon I stand is holy ground, because God is here. That is the only place where God is, here. Then if God is here, Is there anything else for us to do except rest in that word? In thy presence is fullness of joy. Where is God's presence? Here. Then right here is the fullness of joy. Could there be fullness of joy if there wasn't fullness of health and fullness of supply and fullness of happy relationships and fullness of all good? Of course not. Then right here is the fullness of spiritual peace and harmony and glory. Not your glory or mine, God's glory. Right here. Here is God's glory fulfilled. Not by virtue of your praying for it, by virtue of God's nature to fulfill himself. Here. If there is any prayer at all, it is this prayer of recognition, of acknowledgement, of realization. Prayer is not asking anything of God. And now tonight we're learning that prayer is not expecting anything of God. Because if there is any place where God is not now expressed in his fullness, there must be some place outside of God, which couldn't be if the nature of God is infinite being. Infinite being includes all being. Therefore, here where I am, God is. Here where he is, she is. Here where they are, God is. Shall I then pray for God to do something or acknowledge that God's presence is the doing of it? Does God need to be reminded by me of what I need? Or what you need? Or what your family needs? Or are we to acknowledge that in the omniscience of God, the all-wisdom, in the omnipotence of God, the all-power, in the omnipresence of God, the here-ness and now-ness of God, God is functioning? Isn't that enough of prayer? Acknowledge him in all thy ways, and he will give thee peace. Lean not unto thine own understanding. Don't tell God what you need or what your child needs. Don't tell God what the United States needs. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul. How can you love God unless you understand God to be the all-wisdom of this world, the all-power of this world, the all-presence of this world? And then when you understand, here where I am, God is, then you rest. You rest. You don't tell God. You don't ask God. You don't expect of God. You release God in the realization God's presence is enough for me. Thy grace is my sufficiency. That is not a prayer of asking for anything, expecting anything. That is a statement of truth. Thy grace is my sufficiency. Then rest and let God's grace be made evident. But you see, the mind must come to rest. It is like the story of the Hebrew prophet who, when his people said to him, the enemy is coming at us, the armies of the alien, and they outnumber us. And he said, they have only the arm of flesh. And they rested in his word. Think, this is important. Think. They rested in his word. They did no more battling, they did no more arguing, they did no more lighting of candles. They just rested in his word. And then the enemy fought among themselves and destroyed themselves while they rested in his word. Once you have acknowledged omnipresence, here where I am, God is. The place whereon I stand is holy ground. You have nothing more to do with God now except rest in this word. Rest in this word. Loose God and let him go. Release him. And you'll find then that he hasn't loosed you or released you. That he has a firm grip on all that concerns you. It is only when we are trying to use God that we lose the way. It is only when we try to use spiritual power that we lose the way. It is only when we start praying to God to tell him what we need and probably what day we need it that we lose the way. We begin to find God's grace when we release him. When we release him in the understanding why there can only be one power. And if there is only one power, spiritual power, why should I fear a material condition? Why should I fear a mental condition? Why should I fear a human condition of any kind if there is only one power? And then we rest in that word. Now you'll find that in some measure this principle will never leave you nor forsake you. You'll never again be quite the same. But on the other hand, you may be surprised that it doesn't do what it should do. It should instantaneously wipe out of us all sin, disease, death, lack, and limitation. But the reason it won't is that it can only do this for us in proportion as we can spiritually feel it within us. Not merely intellectually agree that it's true. That is a first and necessary step. But there is another step. Abide in it. Live with it. Apply it every day to whatever situation you face until one day you'll wake up. Yes, I can tell you what happens. I get letters in the mail sometime telling me, I made a great discovery yesterday. I had a wonderful revelation. Did you know God is the only power? I get letters like that. Yes, and somebody else has a great revelation one day. They're going to write a book about it. Evil isn't power. Evil isn't power. They're going to write a book about it. It's on every single page of every Infinite Way book. But you see, they read it and read it and read it, and it's in the mind, but it hasn't yet registered. They haven't heard it with their spiritual ears. And then one day, all of a sudden, it dawns on them, oh, God is love. And then they go back and find that John said that 2,000 years ago. They thought it was completely original. But it isn't only they, it's me too. Be assured that many, many wonderful truths have come through me in the years that these books are being written, and be assured too that sometimes 2 and 3 and 4 years later I woke up and discovered that truth and then went back and found they were in the books already. Why? Because when they first come through, they're beautiful truths, but they're really only seeds planted in consciousness, and it takes time for them to take root inside and then to come forth as a full blossoming tree of life. We all have that experience, everyone. Some of the simplest truths that we're all sure that we know, someday you will discover you never knew at all. It'll all come to you as fresh as if you'd never heard it. And then when you go back and found you knew it all the time, You'll say, well, why didn't I really know it? Look what it would do for me. But that's all right. It's part of our experience. Unfortunately, we were conceived and brought forth separate and apart from God. The day is dawning now when young couples are realizing, even when they marry, that they're not going to create children. They're just going to be the instruments through which God is going to send His children. And then they will accept their children not as theirs, but as gifts of God, full of the glory of God and the grace of God and the beauty of God. And then children won't grow up in fear of two powers. They won't grow up in the teaching that don't talk to strangers, you might be kidnapped, and don't walk across the street, you might get run over. But they'll be brought up in the realization there is only one power, there is only one presence. You go where you like because you never can escape from the presence of God. And then you see we'll have a different kind of a generation of people. They won't be mortals who have to die and be reborn of the Spirit. They will be conceived and born of the Spirit right to begin with. And that day is coming. We are witnessing it in youngsters who are just now being born. We are witnessing it in the case of young children who are being brought up by mothers who have learned this truth and are practicing this truth. And we are witnessing the difference in those children, in their lives, in their health, in their intelligence, in their experiences. And we're seeing very, very wonderful things. Not yet on a broad enough scale to say the world has changed, but on a broad enough scale to say we know now how it is done and what the fruitage of it is. But watch first your experience before you expect it of your children or your grandchildren. Watch to what degree you can accept God as omniscience, the all-wisdom, the all-knowing. God as the omnipotent, the only power. Therefore a power that never needs to be used, because there's no power to use it on. It is the only power. And omnipresence, to where you realize that though you make your bed in hell, God is there. That if you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, God is there, because of omnipresence. There is no presence where God is not. And eventually, when you really experience Paul's vision, neither life nor death can separate me from the love of God. You will have overcome the fear of death, and when you've overcome the fear of death, you will have overcome death itself. Don't ever think that anyone overcomes death until they have overcome the fear of death, until they can agree within themselves, living or dead, I'm still alive. Living or dead, I can never be separated from the love of God. So it's not important to me, really, whether I'm alive or dead. Because dead or alive, I'm alive in God. Then in that overcoming, death has no power. There is then no sting in passing from human sight. By that time we realize everyone has to pass from human sight, at least to make room for someone else to come along. But passing from human sight is no longer a tragedy. Passing from human sight is no longer a source of grieving. I know many will be shocked this month when they read the August letter and read that statement that there have been more troubles caused by birth than by death. We don't always like to think that, but it's true. Much more trouble has been caused in the world by birth than by death. So never think for a moment that it makes any difference to your or my daily experience, whether we're living it in this country or that country, this side of the veil or that side of the veil. For when the veil is torn aside, you will understand the scripture that says, to him light and darkness is the same. Never forget that. To him light and darkness is the same. They're not two different things, they're the same thing. And so is life and death the same thing. They're just an infinite experience of unfolding God. It can't be realized until you realize that God is the only power. And that God is the only power here. Here, wherever it is that I am, up or down, in or out, east or west, above or below, is here. And here, God is the only power. Now think for a minute. Relax just a minute in your seats. Just relax. And think. God is the only power. Isn't it wonderful? God is the only power. I can look out at this world and I can see the appearances: sin, disease, death, lack, limitation, and say, ah, yes, but these can't be true. Let God be true, but every man a liar. Let truth be true, but every appearance a liar. For God is the only power, and all I have to do is rest in that word. And now watch as you see how this truth, day by day, grows in you as a seed is growing. And then one day all of a sudden dawns. And don't be surprised if when it dawns, you're so completely aware of the astounding nature of it that you'll forget that you ever heard it before. And maybe you'll want to sit down and write a book about your new discovery. I'm going to give you a word. I. And I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and just gently say I. Again. And that I is your life eternal. That I is your daily bread. That I is your Savior, your Christ, the Son of God in you. That is the Father that is closer to you than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. I am that I am. That I within me is the Father within me. And it is the substance of my life. It is the substance of my supply. It is the substance of my body. Substance of my health. Therefore, as long as I can abide in that I that is within me, God is fulfilling itself in my experience. Without my begging, without my pleading, without my entreating, just by relaxing. This I that is within me is mighty. This I that is within me is the source of my good. 24 hours a day, asleep or awake. as long as I live in the conscious realization of the presence of this I that is within me, this Father, this Son, for God the Father and God the Son are the same, one. As long as I abide in the realization, my good will ever unfold from within. I have hidden manna. I have meat the world knows not of. And it's all embodied in the word I. I in the midst of me, the Father within me that doeth the works. Thou seest me, thou seest the Father that sent me, for I and the Father are one. Just think, I. You just said it, I. I and the Father are one. Not two, just one. I and the Father are one. And that Father, which I is the hidden manna, the pearl of great price, the meat that the world knows not of. This I in the midst of me is God the Father and God the Son. This I in the midst of me is bread, meat, wine, and water. This I that is within me is the resurrection. Resurrecting me, if necessary, physically, and mentally, and morally, and financially, because it is the resurrection and the ascension. This I, think of this, I and my Father are one. This I within me is God the Father and God the Son, for they are one. Therefore, omnipresence. Omnipresence. Therefore, the presence of God is here where I am. Do you see the connection? God the Father is present where I am, for I and the Father are one. Then I can never be separated from the Father. I can never find myself in a place where the Father is not. For I and the Father is one. I, God the Father, God the Son, is one, here where I am, where I declare it to be, closer to me than breathing, nearer than hands and feet, even in the midst of me is the hidden manna of life. Thank you. Thank you.